On the night of May 8th to 9th, 1945, the Act of Germany's surrender was signed. The main stage of the Second World War, the largest war in human history, had come to an end. Not only did the German army lose, but so did its industry, including its tank production. The defeat occurred not only on the battlefields, but also in the factory workshops and on the drawing boards of engineers. The victor was the Soviet Union. At the conclusion of the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army possessed the largest armored forces in the world. Unlike the situation in the summer of 1941, this was now not only a numerical but also a qualitative advantage. Equally important was the fact that German tank development had reached a dead end, while Soviet tank designers were moving, as time proved, in a generally correct direction. Nevertheless, even in the Soviet Union, there were unsuccessful and unpromising solutions. And that is what this story will tell about. Undoubtedly, each tank design school had its own approach to development. Yet if one examines the issue closely, it becomes clear that the main concept, especially at the early stages of evolution, was often quite similar, particularly when it came to medium tanks. The general formula for next-generation medium tanks, whose development began in 1942 to 1943, was roughly the same for the USSR, Germany, the United States, and Great Britain. A combat weight of about 66,000 pounds, equivalent to 30 tons, and a specific power ideally around 20 horsepower per ton. However, this concept quickly began to fade away for most participants. The first to fail in maintaining it were the Germans. Their medium tanks of the VK 30.01 series had an initial combat weight of 77,000 pounds, 35 tons. At the same time, they did not intend to give up the specific power of 20 horsepower per ton, at least theoretically when the engine was running at maximum output. In practice, even the first prototype of the next model already exceeded 77,000 pounds, while the production Panther reached 99,000 pounds, 45 tons, even though it was originally designed for 77,000. The ground pressure did not become extreme, but the increased load on the running gear did not go unnoticed. German test reports frequently contained photographs of destroyed rubber tires on the road wheels and broken torsion bars. The Americans also failed to resist the increase in combat weight. For quite some time, they tried to stay within reasonable limits, but in the end, their 66,000-pound medium tank turned into a heavy one weighing more than 88,000 pounds. It was heavy only in terms of mass. The British, too, could not fit within the 66,000-pound limit from the very beginning. Already at the prototype stage, their heavy cruiser, known as the Centurion, had a combat weight exceeding 88,000 pounds, more than 40 tons. The most disappointing part was that despite this increase in weight, neither the British nor the American vehicle could boast reliable armor protection. Moreover, their specific power was notably worse than that of the Panther. For the British tank, the situation only deteriorated further. The Americans managed to address the issue by creating the M46 medium tank, but it appeared only in 1949, and the question of armor protection still remained unresolved. Soviet tank designers could not afford such luxury. The new Soviet medium tank was not created from scratch. Part of its running gear was based on the T-34. That tank already had a problem. Its combat weight slightly exceeded 66,000 pounds, which often led to the destruction of the rubber tires on the road wheels. Therefore, not only 88,000 pounds, but even 77,000 pounds was an extremely undesirable threshold for the new generation of tanks. Ideally, the combat weight was estimated at between 66,000 and 70,500 pounds, about 30 to 32 tons, no more. Within such strict limits, it was possible to remain within reason. For a number of reasons, the T-44 did not make it to the war, but afterward this chassis became the foundation of Soviet medium tanks for several decades. In addition, the prototype of the T-54 medium tank, which entered testing in early 1945, already had a partially modernized running gear. As a result, this tank with thicker armor and a weight of 78,300 pounds, about 35.5 tons, no longer suffered from problems with the rubber tires on the road wheels. Another important factor was the potential for further development of the new generation chassis. The production T-44 initially had armor that clearly surpassed that of the British Centurion and the American heavy tank. Its frontal plate could not be penetrated even by the 75mm gun mounted on the German Panther. However, by the end of 1944, it became clear that the T-44's armament was outdated, and its armor protection required strengthening since the new benchmark was the powerful German 88mm gun. This led to the creation of the experimental T-54. Due to the increased weight, both protection and firepower improved significantly. For the Panther, such a trick would not have worked. Even if an 88mm gun had been installed, its combat weight would have increased by at least 1 ton, about 2,200 pounds, which meant greater stress on the chassis. Moreover, most of this additional load would have fallen on the front part, and the Germans had already experienced what that meant with the Jagd Panther self-propelled gun. Its side gearboxes failed with unpleasant regularity. As for armor protection, the reserves for reinforcement had already been exhausted in the very first version of the vehicle. Its combat weight quickly approached 50 tons, 110,000 pounds, and easily surpassed it. The specific ground pressure instantly exceeded 14 pounds per square inch, and mobility dropped sharply. It should be noted right away that in the case of the Panther, it would be a serious mistake to write it off. In terms of the balance of combat characteristics, this machine remained the best medium tank until the end of the war. The problem was that it possessed several inherent flaws, and its further development was extremely questionable. The only reason the Panther retained its superiority in its class was that, for various reasons, its main opponents were late with their counterparts. Moreover, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States, engineers simultaneously worked on modernizing existing mass-produced tanks. The result was large-scale vehicles that, while perhaps not fully matching the Panther in combat, were by no means just background figures. For approximately 4,850 Panthers produced in 1944 and 1945, there were about 16,000 T-34-85s. Considering that the primary task of tanks is not to destroy their own kind, this arithmetic was grim for the Germans. And that's without counting the American Sherman medium tanks equipped with 76mm guns. If we look at the situation with heavy tanks, the Germans fared even worse. Again, because Soviet tank development followed a different path. Initially, the evolution of Soviet heavy tanks proceeded along the familiar route of increasing armor protection. At the beginning of 1942, this led to the mass failure of heavy tanks. As a result, the KV-1S appeared, with a combat weight of 42 tons, about 93,000 pounds, and by the end of 1943, the IS-85 emerged, soon replaced by the IS-2 with a much more powerful gun. At the same time, the IS-2's combat weight reached 46 tons, roughly 101,000 pounds, slightly more than the Panthers. The Germans took a different path, creating the 68-ton, 150,000 pounds, new Tiger, which, in essence, was a very successful execution of an utterly insane task. The tank turned out to be far too large and far too heavy, and its armor protection proved to be much less reliable than it had seemed at the beginning of the design process. The overall reliability of the vehicle was terrible, and its potential for modernization completely exhausted. At the same time, the IS-2 was by no means inferior to the new Tiger, especially the tanks that went into production from August 1944 onward. Moreover, in April, serial production of the IS-3 began. It was only slightly heavier than the IS-2, but its armor protection had significantly improved. This tank missed the war by a very short time. Yet even if we consider only the IS-2, the situation for the Germans still looked grim. Even in terms of losses, the IS-2 proved superior to German combat vehicles, despite being far more common on the battlefield. A similar situation emerged with self-propelled artillery. Soviet self-propelled guns surpassed the enemy both in quality and in quantity. This was especially evident when it came to heavy, self-propelled vehicles. An important factor was the presence of advanced designs, primarily the machines under the code names Su-101 and Object 704. And while the first model suffered from engine overheating, the second one could very well have entered mass production. As with tanks, Soviet self-propelled guns were developed within reasonable weight categories. As for their German counterparts, the prospects for further development had ended back in 1944. In essence, the Germans had driven themselves into a dead end, and by then it was already too late to correct the situation. From all this, one might get the impression that by the end of the war, everything in Soviet tank design was perfect. In reality, that was not the case. There were more than enough problems, and we will discuss them later. However, it would be incorrect to assess the state of Soviet tank forces and tank industry separately from other nations. In that context, the Soviet Union clearly stood as the leader. It was the only country capable of organizing the production of a new generation of heavy tanks, reliably protected from the main types of German weaponry. There were other achievements as well, especially when compared to what was happening not only in Germany but also in the United States and Great Britain. During the evolution of Soviet armored vehicles, great effort was devoted to improving armor protection, both for medium and heavy tanks. At the beginning of the war, there had been a tendency toward uniform armor thickness around the entire hull. But by 1943, the general trend had shifted toward differentiated armor protection. This was a global tendency that appeared and disappeared over time, but during the Second World War, differentiated armor became the established standard. From time to time, however, the main armored directorate of the Red Army revisited the idea of making the side armor at least close in strength to the frontal armor. This was due to the fact that roughly half of all hits struck the sides of hulls and turrets. One example of such an attempt was the heavy IS-3 tank, whose side protection, particularly in the upper hull and turret, was comparable to the frontal armor of the IS-2 and even slightly exceeded it. However, such cases were rare exceptions. A simple calculation showed that with such a level of protection, the tank's overall weight became excessive. When it comes to armor, it must be remembered that its strength is far from being determined only by its thickness. The quality of the armor played a very important role, as did the welding seams, and problems often arose with the latter. For example, during shelling tests of the frontal part of the serial T-44, the upper glacis plate withstood hits from 3.5-inch armor-piercing shells fired from a German anti-tank gun. However, due to the destruction of the welds, the lower glacis plate fell off entirely. Welding seams often became a cause of disputes regarding heavy tanks as well. Moreover, the chemical composition of the armor and the quality of its manufacturing frequently caused situations in which its thickness did not guarantee protection. A good example of this was the testing of the turrets of the IS-6 and IS-3 tanks. Both cracked after several hits. In the case of the IS-6, the problem also lay in the poorly chosen shape of the turret sides, while for the IS-3, the issue was in the armor composition and the presence of internal cracks. During serial production, the armor composition was changed, so referencing the shelling results of IS-3 prototype turrets is incorrect. Incidentally, the results of the IS-6 turret tests also influenced the T-54 development program. The Design Bureau of Factory No. 183, when developing the prototype turret, was initially guided by the IS-6, but later had to redesign the turret using the IS-3 as a model. After that, the tank simply became overloaded with armor. In February 1949, production of the T-54 model of 1946 was discontinued, and only at the end of that year was the T-54 model of 1949 launched into series production. The upper glacis plate of the hull was reduced by 0.8 inches, which decreased the total weight by approximately 1,100 pounds. The turret was also modified, as was the suspension system, and so on. It is worth noting that the demand to strengthen armor repeatedly led some tank development programs into a dead end. For instance, this was the reason why the new light tank, which was never built, died. It was being developed between 1943 and 1944 in the Design Bureau of the plant headed by Isaac Semyonovich Bushnev. This combat vehicle was intended to continue the concept of the previous light tank, but with reinforced armament, a 76mm gun, about 3 inches, with the ballistics of an anti-aircraft cannon, and armor thickness reaching 75mm, almost 3 inches. However, the main armor directorate of the Red Army demanded an 85mm gun, 3.3 inches, and frontal armor 90mm thick, 3.5 inches. Yes, they wanted protection from a powerful German anti-tank gun on a light tank. This inflation of requirements continued all the way into 1945. The fact was that the main armored directorate of the Red Army had its own peculiar understanding of what a light tank should be. They still believed a light tank was something like a medium one, just smaller and lighter. But in the realities of 1943 to 1945, that became simply impossible. As a result, they ended up with neither a light tank nor a platform for a light self-propelled gun. To understand the problem, it is worth noting that the chassis load limits of the Su-76M self-propelled gun were already exhausted back in 1943. That is precisely why the serial version of the vehicle had no roof. It was removed to lighten the chassis. Meanwhile, the main armored directorate of the Red Army continued drafting technical requirements for light, self-propelled guns that demanded frontal protection against a German anti-tank gun and a combat weight of 25 tons, 55,000 pounds. The outcome of this is quite obvious. Across the ocean, however, everything was understood much earlier. Already at the beginning of 1943, the Americans created the light tank M24 and a family of self-propelled guns based on it. Its 1-inch frontal armor was not a problem. Instead, its high mobility allowed it to fulfill its role as a reconnaissance tank very well. The same requirements for armor protection nearly led to a serious disaster in the spring of 1945. The thing was that at the main armored directorate of the Red Army and also at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, the IS-3 was considered a vehicle with insufficient armor protection. They seriously believed that it would be better to put another heavy tank into production. Only the position of the leadership of the People's Commissariat of the Tank Industry, which clearly understood the state of the tank industry, made it possible to defend the IS-3. The future showed that putting the IS-3 into series production was the only correct decision. In 1944, the combat weight of that alternative tank was slightly less than 55 tons, 121,000 pounds, and by 1945 it had already reached 56 tons, 123,000 pounds. Meanwhile, the serial IS-4 tank, which was accepted into service on April 29, 1946, had a combat weight of 60 tons, 132,000 pounds. Its production, and even more so its operation, turned into a great drama, and even a modernization in the 1950s did not help much. The IS-3 also proved problematic, but for completely different reasons. The tank was launched into series production essentially as is, so there was simply no time left for refinement. At the same time, its active operation lasted for several decades. 2 modernization programs significantly improved its reliability. In a word, it is not the IS-4 at all. As for the accusations of insufficient armor protection, they provoke a smile. The fact is that in some respects, the IS-3 was more protected than the IS-4. Moreover, sufficient protection was proven by combat use. The frontal part of the hull could not be penetrated by an armor-piercing round from a 105mm gun, 4.1 inches, which was more powerful than the German anti-tank gun. And this was more than 2 decades after production of the IS-3 had ceased. At the same time, the IS-4 did not go anywhere beyond fortified areas. A similar situation arose with medium self-propelled guns. The desire to create a combat vehicle that could withstand blows from a powerful German anti-tank gun both from the front and partially from the sides led to predictable problems. The self-propelled gun chosen as the model for developing the future vehicle weighed 69,700 pounds. But the tank forces leadership introduced a multitude of changes, and as a result, what came out was what came out. The combat vehicle's weight reached 75,000 pounds, 6,600 pounds more than the base T-44 tank, which partly led to engine overheating problems. And that was only part of the trouble. The attempt to protect the side plates from fire by the German gun led to a significant reduction of space in the fighting compartment. At the same time, adequate protection was still not achieved, as shown by firing tests. In a word, the vehicle became the most protected medium self-propelled gun of the wartime period, but this partly harmed it. It is not very clear why anyone needed a medium tank destroyer that would take blows to the side of the casemate. In addition, further work was transferred to another plant, simultaneously changing the base platform. As a result, the successor to the Su-100 self-propelled gun was accepted into service with the Soviet Army on March 15, 1954, when, by and large, it was no longer needed. It had almost the same armament as the earlier vehicle, and the frontal armor protection differed little from the machine created 9 years earlier. The side plates turned out to be only 5 millimeters thicker compared with the previous variant. The strangest story turned out to be that of another self-propelled mount, Kirovets II. Unlike the previous vehicle, it did not suffer from overheating. On the contrary, it proved to be more reliable than the first experimental tank's IS-3. It also suffered from the obsessive idea of protecting the sides from the German gun, but to a lesser degree. The work of the loader and the sponson crew worsened because the rational angles of the side plates of the fighting compartment ate up part of the space for ammunition. This was noted in the machine test reports. At the same time, the vehicle turned out to be successful and entirely suitable for entering series production. It was arguably the most protected in its class, while having a combat mass of 106,000 pounds. But here is the trouble. The tank branch leadership had already spent enough time thinking about a self-propelled mount based on another platform. As a result, the next heavy self-propelled gun entered factory trials only in 1956, when, much like the other vehicle, it was no longer particularly needed. Need it be said that there was simply no significant difference between the machines separated by an 11-year interval? In 1945, a situation developed in the USSR that was somewhat different from what was happening in the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. Soviet tank building had broken ahead, but at some point, instead of stopping and carefully analyzing the tanks of enemies and allies, the tank force leadership continued to pump up fighting vehicles. An excessive pretext for this was the German super heavy tank Maus, discovered in May of 1945. The very first information about this vehicle forced a review of the heavy tank development program. In essence, the IS-7 was a tank designed against the German Maus, which had already died in 1944. Heavy self-propelled guns were also developed with the aim of destroying mice. From the second half of 1945 to February of 1949, work proceeded that deserves a separate story. It can only be said that the results of these works turned out to be largely without prospects. In 1949, there was a reset. Fortunately, the situation among the former Allies was no better, and in some ways even worse. Although overall the situation in Soviet tank building at the end of the war was more or less decent, there were also serious problems. They did not arise only because the main armored directorate of the Red Army wanted tanks to fight some imaginary enemy. A tank, like a self-propelled gun, is a very complex machine composed of many parts and mechanisms. Besides armored protection, a powerful engine is needed to provide the necessary mobility, a reliable running gear, quality observation instruments, powerful armament, and so on. In many components, Soviet tank building managed to make significant catch-up improvements and even partially break ahead. At the same time, a number of problematic issues existed, and they were not resolved even in the early post-war period. It should be noted again that these problems were not unique. Much of what the Soviet Union faced at the end of the war was also observed in other countries. We should begin with one of the most problematic points: the power plant. The question of creating a tank engine more powerful than the diesel V2 series engine was taken up as early as 1940. These developments were based on the same V2 engine, which was modernized, and a mechanical supercharger was also fitted to it. However, beyond experimental work, this activity did not progress. The possibility of a tank version of the M50 diesel engine was also considered. After the start of the war, work on this topic ceased, and the attempt in 1942 to create a forced variant of the V2 engine up to 700 horsepower proved unsuccessful. There were also complaints about the V2K engine, particularly regarding its reliability. In 1943, an improved engine V2IS appeared. Its maximum power was reduced to 520 horsepower, but reliability increased. From then on, the W2IS engine served as the basis for the Vi-244 motor, thanks to which Soviet medium tanks finally received a somewhat more powerful power plant. Another matter was that the specific power of the IS tank was considered insufficient, so as early as 1943, work began on modernizing the W2IS engine. The problem was that instead of 700 horsepower, the W11 engine, the most successful of the new motors, still developed only 520 horsepower. And later, reliability problems also appeared. The W16F motor, which was planned for the tank Obyekt 257, even at a power of 600 horsepower, had insufficient reliability. All that could be done was the W12 motor, essentially a revived version of the 850 horsepower W2SN, but with a power of 750 horsepower. It was this motor fitted with a supercharger from the aircraft engine AM-38 that was installed on the tank Object 701. Further work proceeded in the direction of creating new motors, but the vast majority of these power plants did not advance beyond experimental prototypes. Engines of the W2 family became typical for Soviet tanks for many decades. To be fair, a terrible situation with engines was observed in other countries as well. The British for a long time used the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine and its variants, and this engine first appeared in 1942. In the Americans, a fundamentally new and quite successful engine, the Continental AV 1790, appeared only in 1948. By the end of the war, most countries had trouble with engines. Another important issue was tank armament. From 1944, the primary weapon, initially for medium self-propelled guns and later for medium tanks of the Red Army, became the 100mm gun named D-10. This was a good gun, ideally suited to medium-class machines, but with one important drawback. Contrary to initial calculations, its real ability to penetrate the armor of German tanks proved to be lower than that of the 122mm gun D-25T. At the same time, even for that 122mm system, its penetrating ability was considered insufficient as early as the end of 1943. Therefore, on February 25, 1945, technical requirements were drawn up for a new 100mm self-propelled gun with a muzzle velocity of 3,280 feet per second. In practice, work on this gun was greatly prolonged. The D-46 gun, created according to these requirements, did not go beyond experimental prototypes, and the same happened with the later D-54 model. Therefore, the D-10 gun proved to be long-lived. The same fate befell the D-25T gun. The 122mm tank gun BL-13 with a higher muzzle velocity also did not progress beyond experimental prototypes, while the D-25 gun in various versions served until the mid-1950s, until it was replaced by the M62 model. The history of guns for heavy self-propelled guns ended in a similar way. Again, everything is understood in comparison. The Americans ended the war with the 90mm gun M3, which had even lower penetration than the Soviet D-10T. Attempts to replace that gun led to nothing, so it gradually improved, was installed on American tanks up until the appearance of the M60 Patton tank. The British ended the war with the 17-pounder, approximately 76mm gun, and only at the end of the 1940s did they create the 20-pounder, about 84mm gun, essentially their version of the German PaK-43 gun. The next system, the 105mm L7 gun, appeared already in the second half of the 1950s. A gun for heavy tanks of the new generation among the former allies of the anti-Hitler coalition also appeared after the war, and they came to the same conclusion as Soviet weapons designers. Long-barreled medium-caliber guns, which the Germans so loved, proved to be a dead-end path of development, while the optimal system turned out to be a caliber of 120 to 122mm with anti-aircraft ballistics. Finally, there was another problem, especially relevant for medium tanks. As already mentioned, the increasing demands for armament and armor protection led to the fact that even the promising T-54 tank had a combat weight close to the limit from the very beginning. At the same time, plant number 183 had certain restrictions directly related to tank production. They wanted to redesign the running gear of the T-34 tank as early as 1941, but even the example of the T-34M shows that, in the end, they chose the most conservative option, aiming for production feasibility. This tendency can be clearly seen in the projects led by Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov. This then carried over to the T-44 tank. Experiments with road wheels ended with the serial tank still using wheels measuring 32.7 by 5.9 inches. Even on the prototype T-54, the same concept was retained, although the running gear differed from the start since the width of the road wheels had increased, and the suspension arms proved incompatible with those of the T-34 and T-44 tanks. In serial production, the diameter of the T-54's road wheels decreased to 31.9 inches, but a fundamentally new platform never emerged. The introduction of new elements, such as the pin-type engagement of the track links, also faced great difficulties. The issue was not so much Morozov's conservatism as the fact that the medium tank remained the main development priority. Creating an entirely new vehicle threatened to seriously disrupt production. That is why the T-44 was produced at plant number 75, a facility not engaged in the main output of T-34-85 tanks. Another issue in the development of future medium tanks was that it occurred without any real competition. When it came to heavy tanks, there were usually two competing designs, allowing for choice. For example, the Kurovets 1 tank had a competitor in the IS-2U. Work on entirely new platforms also progressed much more actively in that category. But with the T-44 and T-54, these were the only options. There were no alternatives. However, anyone who thinks such a problem existed only in the Soviet Union is very mistaken. The exact same processes that affected Soviet medium tanks can be seen in the development of American medium tanks. Tank design was concentrated in the hands of the military, who believed that a platform should be perfected and only then mass-produced. When someone jokes that the T-34 was merely an evolution of the BT tank concept, one might just as easily recall that the American medium tank M4 traced its lineage back to the light tank T-2, whose development began in the spring of 1933. From a conceptual standpoint, they were much closer to each other than the T-34 was to the BT. Yet, at least in the USSR, they never thought of inflating a medium tank to make a heavy one, something the Americans did when they launched the development of the heavy tank T-29, which ultimately proved unsuccessful. Overall, it should be noted that 1945 became a crisis year for almost the entire global tank industry. The development of individual components, primarily armament and engines, simply could not keep up with the demands. Moreover, by 1945, the situation had arisen where the guns for medium tanks and self-propelled guns had reached the limits of what their chassis could handle. As a result, in 1946, the Americans simply halted the development of self-propelled anti-tank guns since they no longer made sense. Tanks now carried the same armament. In addition, the process of re-evaluating wartime experience had begun. This process continued for a long time, and in many parts of the world, some conclusions were not drawn until the second half of the 1940s, or even into the 1960s. In this regard, it would benefit many to re-watch the documentary The Pentagon Wars several times, the best film ever made about the creation and implementation of armored vehicles. The problems described in that production remain relevant even today, especially the relationship between manufacturers and clients.